Hello and welcome to Weird Together. I'm Brennan Storr, host of the Ghost Story Guys podcast.
I'm Joseph Camo, host of The Cardinal Rule.
And this is a show where we celebrate the latest and greatest in independent horror films. Or usually, except on this episode, because it's thematically appropriate, we're celebrating a film that is 2 years old. We're not critics.
We're not experts.
We're just weird. Together. Joseph, my friend, this is the last episode of, I guess, technically what you would call the first season of Weird Together. How you doing?
I am doing great. The semester is almost over. Did I mention I have a PhD?
No, this has never come up in the entire course of our friendship.
So I'm an academic, so the semester's almost over. So
I got to Google
what
academic.
Right. A-C-A. No, so it's, yeah.
I think that means you fly planes.
Yes, that's exactly what it means. So I'm going to be off for a month, which, for between semesters, which is grand. So I remember years ago, I was hanging out with a couple friends, and one of my friends, good friend of mine, was talking about how, he wanted to bust his ass so he could retire young and, work really hard and, kind of do that thing and then retire young. And one of my other friends we were hanging out there with was also an academic. She's like, or you could get a job where you're off for a third of the year. And that's the path I've chosen. So, really looking forward to this break. I love what I do, but part of the reason I love it is because I get breaks. So, yeah. How are you, Bren?
Well, I am not cushioned by the bosom of academia. I mean, I only work a third of the time, but that's because I'm chronically underemployed.
That's fair.
Yeah. Although I'm about to start some side work, which I'm not going to talk about on air for insurance reasons. But yeah, so that'll help me stave off the wolves of hunger. So no, I am good. My life, as I mentioned previously, I was invited to take part in a short film a couple weeks back. I did that. I was riding the high of the dopamine surge of doing something novel and being around people all the time. And so I was really good for about a week after that. And now I'm back down to my usual emotional roller coaster. So, I'm an Italian man, but I am an Italian man who is very excited to talk about today's film. This is a film that I was a big fan of when it first came out in 2021, and I've seen it now about 4 times, and I remain a fan of that film. And that film is Casey Tebo's Black Friday. All right, Joseph, so before we talk about Black Friday, we have to do that thing we do on this show where we acknowledge that you never watch a film in a vacuum. You go in there with your expectations, you go in there with your past experience, you go in there with the day you had. And so before we talk about Black Friday, we got to unpack the baggage. All right. So Joseph, what was your baggage going into Black Friday?
As is often the case, I wasn't familiar with the film or the filmmaker. So the premise or the name of it, that it is something, named Black Friday, that is clearly kind of playing off of, the capitalist artifact that is Black Friday. I had a feeling it was going to be a film that was going to not take itself too serious. It was going to be kind of more fun than anything, like Barbarian, a film that we did that was really fantastic recently. It was much more of a serious story kind of film. So I knew it was in for something that I was going to have to kind of just enjoy as something a little tongue in cheek. And then when I saw the movie poster with Bruce Campbell, and we know, his history in terms of films, I had a pretty good idea what this was going to be. It's going to be sort of a fun romp and hopefully doesn't take itself too seriously, and ended up being that's more or less what it was. So that was kind of what I had going into it.
As is usually the case, I have more baggage with this movie. This one's a weird one though, because through a strange series of circumstances, last spring, I helped Casey Tebo get his Instagram account back.
Okay.
And yeah. So just to quickly break that down, I first heard about Tebo on the Movie Crypt podcast in like 2019-ish. I watched his movie Happy Birthday, which I quite enjoyed. And I think I posted about it on Instagram, and he replied, saying thank you for watching it. And we just exchanged a couple words. So I just always, if someone's going to be like with you and me with Spider One, when we had that conversation with him about Allegoria, if someone takes the time to respond like that, I just tend to pay more attention to their art. And so when I knew Tebo had Black Friday coming out, I made sure to keep an eye out for it. So I'm not going to say I know him, but we've had a few conversations, and then again, spring 2022, I helped him get his Instagram account back. So that is my baggage going into Black Friday. And I'm very curious to hear your take on this one, not only because, I quite like the film, but because I think it is really rich in terms of subtext. I think there's a lot to talk about here. And of course, there's only one place we can do something like that, and that's the Talktagon. Welcome to the Talktagon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave. All right, Joseph, what were your thoughts on Black Friday?
Well, it was fun, right? It didn't take itself too seriously, as we talked about earlier, a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek look at kind of consumerism and rampant capitalism. So I enjoyed that overall. Overall, I probably didn't like it quite as much as you, which is, again, a pattern here. But I did enjoy it. I think it knew what it was, and it stuck to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it manages to pull off something that I think a lot of genre films struggle with, which is it manages to be a fun action horror comedy while having characters you actually give a shit about. You know, there's that moment where the film sort of slows down a little bit for the characters to interact in the back of the store. And there's some stuff that in that conversation they have that I really do want to get into later. But just having that moment for these characters to talk to each other, I thought was really great. And again, not something you often get to see. And I, like, to a point, I get it, right? Because horror films quite often, they assemble a cast of characters for you to then watch get murdered one by one, right? And you don't want to get too attached to them, because then you're not going to be engaging with the thrills of the kill. You're going to be going, oh, geez, R.I.P. Jerry, you know? And I've definitely had that experience watching movies. Like there was one, bizarrely, The Mutilator. I was watching it and I thought, boy, this is actually a really good movie. I just want these kids to have a nice weekend. And they did not, Joseph, they did not. So that was something that Black Friday did that I really appreciated, was that it was a horror film that actually took the time to flesh out its characters and to give them arcs, or at least some of them arcs, which, again, not often something you see in these kinds of movies.
Yeah, I would generally agree. I mean, I think they had a nice range of characters, some that were a little more serious than others, some that were a little bit more caricatures, like Brian, you know, the kind of the assistant manager felt very much like a caricature, whereas some of the other characters were a little bit more fleshed out. So I think there were a few points for me where the humor didn't always land for me. Sometimes it did. I thought Dower Dennis, voiced by Seth Green, was one of the funnier parts of the film. I really enjoyed the Teddy Ruxpin meets Dilbert, although Dilbert, not a fan of, if you follow the creator.
Dilbert when it was funny.
When it was funny and not, problematic.
Before we knew who Scott Adams was.
Exactly. You know, so there were moments that were funny, right? There were absolutely moments that were funny, but there were points where it didn't quite land as well for me. So it was a little uneven in that regard. But, you know, again, this is nitpicking maybe. Overall, I thought it was reasonably funny.
I thought it looked great, considering that, they had about 18 days to shoot it. And they shot this basically in the height of COVID, so pre-vaccinations. And that's why in the film, there's, I don't know if you caught this, but there's a couple moments where I think it's Bruce Campbell's character says, oh, it's so smoky in here, but it's not. And they actually had they turned the gamma up or something to make it look more grayed out. But it's because at the time, the safety regulations were such they couldn't use any smoke. They couldn't use any fake fog because it was worried that it would somehow, carry or sort of propagate the virus. So they weren't allowed to use anything like that. So I think it had a lot working against it, but I thought it still worked in spite of that. Like the pure joy in just watching Michael Jai White kick some ass before being taken down by monsters. Like I'll watch Black Dynamite do pretty much anything. Have you seen Black Dynamite? I have not, but I know he was in that, and he was also Spawn. So he was Spawn. Let's actually, you know what? I know a lot of people don't like that Spawn movie. I still quite like that. it had despite the fact that my first girlfriend used to make me listen to the fucking soundtrack on repeat, which was not my kind of music at all. But no, I stand Spawn. But yeah, watching him kick some zombie ass is always a blast. Devon Sawa is always watchable. He's had a really kind of fascinating career arc, and I've seen him in some direct-to-video stuff that is otherwise pretty dreary, but he is always able to do something that just keeps you watching. Like, what was that terrible Terrible Sylvester Stallone movie. Escape, the third Escape Plan film. Sawa plays the villain in that, as if I remember correctly, and he's great. The third Escape Plan film is not great. I've seen all three. The second one is surprisingly good. The second one was directed by Stephen Miller, and Stephen Miller is, I don't think we've covered any of his movies on this show, but Miller is a guy who kind of works in the sort of low like the indie level basically, but he does really great shit. He can make stuff like, you know how Bruce Willis makes these movies where you see his face on the cover and he turns up for about 20 minutes. It's very clear they shot all the scenes in a single day. Miller's made at least, I think, 2 of those, but they're always watchable. They're always watchable. And he's made some really great stuff, you know, like Silent Night, his take on Silent Night, Deadly Night. Very, very good stuff. And he made the second Escape Plan film, which again, I think is really fucking entertaining. It's better than the first, and it had a fraction of the budget. But I remember reading Stallone was very critical of him. And that's why he didn't, originally I think Miller was meant to do 2 and 3. And then Stallone is very critical of him for whatever reason, I assume because he actually had a functioning brain. And he was replaced for the third film, which, again, to the film's detriment. Anyways, this is not about fucking Escape Plan, the Escape Plan trilogy. Anyways, Devon Sawa made Escape Plan 3 better. He's great in this. He's a lot of fun. Because, he gets to play a little bit against type. You know, he's not necessarily the hero. And with the jawline he's got going on, like that dude, he looks like a hero. And he gets to instead play that sort of, quasi-functional arrested adolescent, which, again, I thought he was great at.
I think that was one of the more kind of interesting characters, right? The father and, you know, kind of his kind of the weirdness with his ex and her kind of new partner, but also, you know, kind of the relationship, semi-relationship with the really big age gap, sort of kind of like, yeah, this person is sort of state of arrested development and kind of this really weird place he finds himself in his life. So that was kind of interesting for sure. You know, there was a character I was a little disappointed in, and it's probably because of expectations that I wanted more out of this character, but that was Bruce Campbell's Jonathan Wexler. He had his moments, and I do think his character was sort of a vehicle for one of the more I think relevant subtexts here in terms of kind of the dehumanizing effects of rampant capitalism and how he sort of embodied that. But, you know, this is Bruce Campbell, right? So again, it's maybe expectations, you know, his history in this genre, right? You know, like in terms of like kind of the comedy horror kind of thing. I mean, he's in some of the archetypical films in that genre, right? It felt, you know, you described that sort of Bruce Willis shows up for a little bit of a film, but it's really built around him. Whereas like, I felt like Bruce Campbell's character gave some laughs. I don't want to totally poo-poo it, but it didn't deliver at the level I would have hoped, you know, in terms of, you know, there were a few funny moments and, you know, what have you. I thought his self-sacrifice kind of redemption arc felt unnecessary and forced. Like, why'd he have to jump down that chute? Like, he didn't need to. Like, so I don't know. Again, maybe it's suffering from high expectations because this is the prominent, you know, kind of actor in the film and what he's done in other pieces. I wanted maybe a little bit more from it.
I think that was a common complaint with the film because I think there are so many expectations around Bruce Campbell appearing in genre stuff, right? I mean, Ash casts a long shadow. But I actually really appreciated his portrayal because I think it takes a little bit of an actor who is comfortable in his skin and who's not just doing shtick. And by this point in Bruce Campbell's career, he could be doing shtick. He could just be doing convention appearances and variations on Ash. And his character from Burn Notice, whose name just went right out of my head. But he instead he's taken on stuff like this. Of course, years ago he did Bubba Hotep for Don Coscarelli, and that was actually a surprisingly touching movie. For a film about Elvis with dementia living in a rest home and fighting a zombie that sucks people's souls out their butts, or a mummy that sucks people's souls out their butts. Like it had a surprising amount of pathos. So I actually quite enjoyed Campbell in this because he didn't do the things that we expected him to do. You know, he instead got to play this very, very small, very weak man who is sort of that person we've all met who tries to replace the holes in their life with work and ends up finding it just eats away at you. Because I think that's what happens. And I mean, this is one of the things I think the film really nails. One, I think it nails retail culture very well. I think the writer Andy Kraskowiak, if I remember right, I believe he worked in a Bed Bath & Beyond and a bunch of different places. So he has that experience. And obviously, I worked retail quite a bit when I was younger. This sort of obsession we have in late stage capitalism with work as identity is just, all it does is just eat us from the inside out. All the people I know who have made that their thing, who've been like, oh, all I do is work. They're not fun people to be around. They're not interesting people. And I find too that they're not ever producing, I shouldn't say ever, but quite often they're not really producing anything compelling. There's a filmmaker, I won't say who, I don't want to be a dick about it, but there's a filmmaker whose work I'm aware of who I would say hasn't really made anything in quite some time, but whenever you see them publicly, they're always talking about how busy they are. I don't have time. I'm working. Yeah, but you haven't made anything of interest in a very long time. I mean, I'm sure you can justify why you're busy. We always do. Like we're all, and believe me, I'm as culpable in this as anyone. Like I tend to self-identify with work a little too much. And let's face it, I make a fucking ghost podcast. Like I love it, but I'm not saving lives here. But I think we do that thing where it just becomes who we are. And I think, especially if you've tied your identity to work that is controlled by someone else, like working for a big box store, I think you do end up as this, you kind of have to take on them as part of your persona. And quite often that just means you're an emotionally bankrupt person. And I think for me, it was actually a really cool reversal to see Campbell not be the hero. Instead, he was the very weak, very sad, kind of pathetic guy. And I think people forget too, that's actually a big part of Ash's character, especially if you watch the series Ash vs. Evil Dead. I mean, Ash spends almost as much time running from the fight as he does having it. So I quite like that. I will admit that I found that the redemption part of his arc was really rushed. And I really noticed that on this watch through. I thought, I feel like there could have been a little more there in terms of explaining why he had to sacrifice himself, instead of just like, because the first time the speech, I was like, yeah, I get it. And then kind of as you're not as emotionally invested on subsequent watches, you start to think, hang on. But yeah, so that was sort of my take on Campbell. And if I do recommend watching Bubba Hotep, it is really good.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if my disappointment, that's a strong word, but it not quite living up, is whether I wanted him to be the kind of character he was before. Was I disappointed he'd come out with a chainsaw or something? Or was it because it felt like the character tried to toe the line between being kind of absurd and ridiculous and serious and sympathetic, and maybe didn't kind of pick a lane well enough for me? I don't know. Because there were points of the character that there were a little kind of caricatures, right? And so, but then it didn't maybe lean into that enough. Maybe and maybe that's what, and I didn't need him to be the hero, but I needed him to kind of commit to either being a little more of a caricature or being less of one, more of a serious
fair
role.
enough.
But again, this is all very subjective. So that makes sense. But I think you mentioned something about the representation of retail. And I think that's a really great point you bring up in terms of something that the film did very well. And I think a big part of that, and you kind of alluded to this, is people in very different stations in life all kind of thrown together, right? You have the character you talked about who is, this was supposed to be a temporary job, and he's been there for way too long and stunted kind of emotionally or whatever, man-child or whatever. And then you have, the couple employees, the employee of the month, who takes us way too seriously.
Yes.
And then, these other characters, some of whom this is sort of just a station in life, and others, this is a landing point, and, who have different expectations for this job and different levels of commitment to it. So that was certainly an interesting juxtaposition of all these people together. And that creates those different kind of stations in life, different expectations and different views of this job, end up creating some of those tensions that we see, kind of the conflict when they have those moments and where they're at each other and saying some kind of hurtful things that they later sort of regret. So that was really kind of an interesting thing. I think in Jonathan's character, I mentioned being a device for kind of, and I think this is a really important subtext of this, is that dehumanizing effect of capitalism sort of thing. And like, I'm a sociologist, so I look at how structures and social structures influence behavior and how we create those social structures as well. And you look at it how this structure of profitability and, the corporate expectations to, be profitable drove Bruce Campbell's character, Jonathan Wexler, to like really abandon, at least early in the film, kind of reasonable senses of humanity. No, if we work hard, we can reopen by 2 a.m. right after all this stuff's going down. And it's not until very late in this where, oh no, there's literally alien zombie things or whatever it is that are killing people. Oh, maybe I guess we do have to worry about survival first and profit meeting our goals second. And,
I would say that was unrealistic if we hadn't just gone through COVID.
Right.
And, having all these people just rushing, just for the sake of normality, just for the sake of feeling like everything is okay, even though it's, patently not. People just running back out into the world, coughing in each other's mouths and giving each other, terrible vascular disease that they're trying to convince themselves is just a cough or a flu. I would say that was unrealistic, if not for the events of the last 3 years.
No, and it's interesting that you mentioned it was filmed kind of in the midst of that, right? So I wonder how much of that was an intentional critique of that, right? So
yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. I know I listened to an interview with Tebo where he's talking about he was directing not only wearing a mask but a full face shield, and it's still pretty common to see. Obviously, I'm not involved in that industry, but from press photos I see, there are still quite often crew wearing masks, directors giving direction where they'll be wearing face masks, but the shields are just not done anymore. But at the time, they were fully kitted up, which, I have to imagine made communication a little more difficult when you're trying to build rapport with your actors.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think like 20 years from now, looking back at film and television and, recognizing things that were filmed during the COVID era and the various kind of variations of the face masks and the shields that were used. And the shields, you're right, that was an early kind of adaptation that kind of seemed to go away. You saw a lot of people trying to do that as an alternative for whatever reason, and multiple reasons, I guess. It kind of went back towards the face coverings and the shields kind of went out of vogue.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to spend too much time on it, but that's largely, I think, because the shields don't do anything don't do much. They inhibit direct droplet transmission, but you're still talking and you're still emitting the virus, which then just builds up in the air around you, whereas the mask sort of tamps that down.
Right.
Again,
so
efficacy. When you think, what's that?
So the efficacy is the real reason they went away. They weren't as effective.
Yeah. They were helpful, but they weren't. The mask is still the best form of restricting transmission. And God, I think about that, man. It's hard to imagine that's almost 4 years ago now. It feels both a million miles away and right here.
So going back to that sort of the dehumanizing effect. So like, it is interesting how those structures like shape how we act, because here you have, again, Bruce Campbell acting in kind of inhumane ways, but even at macro levels, you have whole institutions and organizations and industries that will, in the name of profitability, rationalize kind of actions that hurt people, or that lead to harm. And I think this maybe here in Bruce Campbell's character, Jonathan Wexler, you see at a micro level, an individual level, the manifestation of that, but it gets more kind of dangerous, I think, at corporate levels, because you have the people at the top who make these decisions, like, we see as the film unfolds that the holiday bonuses they were all expecting were withheld from this company that's probably quite profitable. And I think that this is something that I talk about in some of my sociology classes. These decisions are made at the top by people who have layers of buffering between them and the people they impact, right? So you have executives who make decisions about bonuses, about salary, about staffing, and that they say, well, this is what we need to do to be profitable. And then they push those things down the pipeline. And at further away you get, you have actors who, and when I say actors, I mean people, not in terms of film actors, but people in society, who then have to make decisions of how to kind of implement those things that come down from on high, right? And those things in an industry like this, it always ends up being profitability means cut costs, increase revenue, right? Increase income. So you have further down, you have people suppressing wages. You have people withholding bonuses. You have people understaffing space, various kinds of spaces and organizations. And those things end up immiserating the people at the bottom. There's a documentary I show in my sociology classes where I talk about that's about the assisted living industry and how these decisions like that made at the top have resulted in this one particular corporation they follow through this documentary, understaffing facilities that lead to people, elderly populations that get harmed and killed, right? Because of accidents and not enough staff monitoring them. And, at the top of the corporate level, they will put down these expectations in terms of, maintaining lower staffing levels and this, that, and the other. But they'll just put the burden on the laborer that, well, you just need to care more about your job and do the best job possible and care for the populations, while they're simultaneously creating a structure where the workers are understaffed and can't realistically do everything. So that's it happens at a large scale level. But here in the film, we saw it more of a just kind of at the worker level, what that looks like, with Jonathan Wexler as sort of the conduit for delivering those evil corporate sort of mandates.
Well, and I think that's the sad thing, right? Because I've seen that situation. I've met Jonathan essentially just in different form. And you get these people who don't have a lot of connections in the world. And he says, this store is my family. I don't have friends. I don't have family. Like, work is kind of who you are. And especially in the modern era, it's even harder to connect to people. People are so overloaded with the expectations of work. People are, they're taking in far too much information through digital means. And I also think that we have, to a certain degree, fetishized being antisocial. I think I'm very critical. Like the meme account I run for the Ghost Story guys, we've built it up to where I've built it up to like 100,000+ followers. And, I'm proud of the fact that I've managed to accomplish this for whatever little it's worth. But, one of the things I've noticed is the stuff that really hits is stuff about being antisocial. Like, oh, people are gross. I can't stand being around people. We're social animals. Sometimes, again, you're overloaded. I get it. But in the end, our only hope is each other. And so we all these things kind of, again, this all these different things form this culture, which just kind of keeps us further and further away from each other. And I think you end up with a lot of people like Jonathan. And I think the problem then is, they latch onto things. They latch onto movements, or they latch onto companies, and they just become their avatars. And I mentioned off air to you about a friend of mine who was not really the person I thought they were. They were just most strongly influenced by whoever happened to be nearest to them at the time. And I think that's what Jonathan is. He spends his time in the company, so he becomes reflective of the corporate culture. And it's only at a late stage in his life, like really at the very end, when he kind of realizes, there might actually be a person in here, and this person doesn't want what my overlords want. But I've worked with a lot of folks who never had that realization. It was just the company is right, the company this, and it's sad because I just think they've never had a chance to access their essential humanity.
Another layer to that is also kind of quite problematic is you reference this sort of feeling of family, right? That some people talk, like, his character says, this is the only family he knows. And a lot of times workplaces will, especially workplaces where people are overworked, underpaid, undercompensated, and undersupported, will talk about this family and we're a family here. And what's really just so kind of frustrating or really kind of just feels evil about that is, there's this sort of idea that we will put up with things from family we wouldn't put up with from other people because there's these stronger bonds, and that's just a family you're supposed to, be more forgiving and more enduring and this, that, and the other. And so it's like, hey, we're not going to pay you enough, and we're going to put you in really stressful, overworked, under-supported situations and talk about being a family so that you will put up with this shit.
Yeah, it's abusive family.
Yeah, right. And you see these really kind of really out of touch corporate types. There was a person who there was a kind of a sound bite from a person. I don't remember who it was and really wouldn't even want to give them mention who they were specifically, but we talked about how employees have gotten very entitled, like workers have gotten entitled and they need to be more fearful of losing their jobs because we're in this era where, so like that's, what he's describing as entitled. I think we would think of as workers actually humans being empowered, to have agency and not be mistreated. But like in the economy that came out of COVID, where there was a point where, a lot of people had not gone back to work or had started their own businesses or had whatever. And there's been a lot of various kind of things have happened in terms of the job market since then. But there was at least a period where workers had more power than they had in the past, and employers didn't like that. And I think those kinds of things all kind of come back to this sort of disparity of power, that kind of power differential or asymmetry. When employers have it, they want us all to be happy family. But when workers actually have it, then employers can't just do that, right? And then they talk about how entitled we are.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a really great book. It's dense, but if some folks might be interested, it's called The Fall of the House of Labor by, I think, Elizabeth Phones Wolf. And it's a really fascinating examination of how basically since the height of organized labor, the government institutions and private institutions have worked very hard to dismantle them and to sort of put workers back under the control of the management. And I think it's because, a powerful worker can determine the cost of his own labor, and that upends the whole system. And I think, the number of idiots who say things like, well, no one wants to work anymore. That's bullshit. And I have seen over and over, this is a motif that's repeated throughout history. Whenever workers demand fair payment for their labor, there is this notion, well, no one wants to work anymore. Well, no one wants to be exploited anymore. To take it back to Black Friday, though, something I really, really loved about the film was the effects work. They just looked great. Like the zombies, I thought they had a really unique look. They didn't go for the sort of just standard shambling, especially once they sort of transformed into their second form, where they had the kind of more prominent jaws. I really thought those were creepy as shit. And the fact that it all in the end kind of turned into a giant kaiju, I am always here for giant kaiju monsters. I remember the first time I watched, I thought, no, oh yeah, okay. And it's just great. Anything that turns into a giant monster that has something that turns into a giant monster by the end, I am on board with. And I just loved the video game-esque way of taking it down, where you sort of move the forklift into position. And I don't know, the whole thing it worked for me.
I jokingly was watching the film just thinking how I enjoyed the fact that in terms of behavior, the infected shoppers were indistinguishable from actual Black Friday holiday shoppers, which was also an interesting social commentary.
Going back to what we were talking about, how people just want things to be normal and will do whatever they can to sort of try and pretend everything is normal, which I think kind of ties into what we were talking about labor exploitation as well, right? We just want to keep moving forward. We don't want to, because if we disrupt things, and then things are disrupted. And like things might be bad, but they're bad I'm used to. And the scene where Chris, who's obviously a germaphobe, where he's called to clean up because a customer has vomited, and the customer's vomited up their entire intestines. And just the notion, I love that, the idea that, well, yeah, it's vomit. It's an entire digestive tract, but whatever, just scoop it up, throw it away, let's get this bitch back on the road. Because how many times have you heard stories about people who've like, oh, we got to clean up in the bathroom, and to say that it's like they should just burn the bathroom down. I've walked into some truck stop bathrooms that looked like they were the site of a murder scene, and I just walked right back out like, nope, I will be peeing in the ditch, thank you.
Yeah, going back to the life of retail. So
yeah, that's it. And just the way it depicted the passive aggression of that world as well, I enjoyed. There's that moment where in the beginning where I can't remember her name, but employee of the month, she notices that Chris's shirt is untucked, and just like, well, that's grounds for a write-up. And I remember that. I remember that someone like that was a thing that had power. I'm gonna write you up. What the fuck does that even mean? You step away from it 20 years away from my time in retail, and I think, who cares? What is, that's a nothing thing. That's,
and we
like,
all knew that person too. We all worked with that person.
Oh, 100%. 100%. So, Joseph, any final thoughts on Black Friday?
It was a fun film. I mean, certainly had a few minor critiques of it, but, overall, I enjoyed it. It knew what it was, and, it kind of stuck with that. And I think it, in general, accomplished what it set out to do.
I agree. I quite like the film. I watch it once a year. And honestly, I just watched Eli Roth's Thanksgiving a little while ago. I went to go see it a couple days after it opened. Actually, no, sorry, I saw a preview screening for it. And it's a hoot. It's a great fun slasher movie. And honestly, it opens the sort of the inciting incident is a Black Friday riot. And so I think it pairs nicely with this film. If you're looking for a great double feature this holiday season, you could do no better, I think, than Eli Roth's Thanksgiving and Black Friday. Black Friday is, I believe, streaming on Prime in Canada at the very least. I'm sure, and I have to believe if it's on Prime in Canada, it probably is in the US. Also, you can rent it on all the standard VOD platforms. Joseph, where can everyone find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at JOKOMO13 and at YouTube, or on YouTube, at The Cardinal Rule. If you're interested in NFL football, that's kind of my other thing I do.
Perfect. I'm Largely the Truth on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. You can find my other show, The Ghost Story Guys, on podcast platforms everywhere. This show is edited by Tonya Downing. All our music is composed and performed by Elliot Wilder of The Revenants. You can find more from him at therevenants1.bandcamp.com or by searching for The Revenants on streaming platforms everywhere. Our theme song is Rest in Peace, also by The Revenants, from their album Music from Big Beige. As we mentioned, this is going to be our last episode for 2023. We will be back in January 2024. Until then, remember, we're weird.
And you're weird.
So why not be weird together?
Let me ride.